Her father had not told her about the arrangement until the morning the wagon was already loaded. She stood in the yard of the homestead where she had spent 26 years, the one with the listing east wall, and the kitchen garden she had grown from nothing but clay and stubbornness. And she listened to him explain it in the voice he used for things he had already decided and was now getting around to saying. The debt to the man on the quarter section north of theirs had been accumulating since March. Seed grain borrowed, the loan of a harrow for 3 weeks, the interest on both carrying forward in a way she had not known about. Her father could not settle it in coin. He had offered her labor instead. 1 season, May through harvest, she would cook, keep house, and do whatever the work required until the ledger came level. He said it, the way he might note that the south field needed draining. She looked at the loaded wagon. She looked at Declan Rafferty, who had already made the arrangement, and now stood with his face turned slightly sideways, in the posture of a man who is better at deciding than at looking at what he's decided. She thought about arguing. She decided there was nothing worth saying that would change what had already been done. She went inside and took what she needed, a change of clothes, the small tin box with her mother's things in it. Her father pressed a folded document into her hands without explanation, and she put it in her coat pocket, because she did not want to read it while he was standing there. She did not say goodbye to the garden. She did not look back at the east wall. The drive north took most of an hour on roads still soft from the May thaw, the wagon pitching and settling through the ruts, the horses steady and untroubled by all of it. Prairie opened out wide on every side, flat to the horizon and flat past it, the sky going enormous and gray-bright with morning light and cold air, and the smell of the earth working itself awake again. She had lived under that sky her whole life. She was still not sure whether it made her feel free or only very visible. The homestead came into view past a stand of poplar, barely leafed, the pale green of the new growth thin and uncertain in the light. The buildings were modest, but she could see from the road that they'd been set square and plumb. The corners true, the roof lines level. The barn was larger than the house. She noted this. She thought about what it said about a man's priorities and filed it the way she filed most things for later. He was in the yard when they pulled in, working a fence rail into a notch with a mallet, his back to them, and he drove the last strike before he turned. She appreciated that. A man who stopped work in the middle of it was either careless or showing off, and she had no use for either. Her father climbed down. They spoke out of her hearing, and then there was the handshake of 2 men settling an account, and her father climbed back up and the horses moved, and the wagon went back down the track the way it had come. She stood in the yard with her bag and did not watch it go. The man came toward her and stopped at a distance that felt considered. Far enough to give her room, close enough to make his address direct. He held out an envelope. Same paper as the document in her coat pocket, same wax seal. "That's your copy of the agreement," he said. "I'd keep it somewhere you can put your hands on it." She took it, turned it over. "If I ask something unreasonable," he said, "or if I act wrong towards you in any way, you leave. Don't stay trying to work it out. Just go." He said it the way he might tell her where the well was, as a fact that applied regardless of whether she needed it right now. "The Whitfords are half a mile east. Lavinia Whitford would take you in without question." She put the envelope in her coat pocket with the other one and stood for a moment with both hands pressed flat against the outside of the pocket, feeling the 2 documents through the wool. "I'll show you where things are," he said, and turned toward the house, and she followed. Kitchen was plain and it was clean. Those were the 2 things she always looked for first, and he had managed both. Good stove, 1 window, the floor worn but swept. Tins on the shelf labeled in a hand that pressed hard enough to score the paper. The back room he indicated as hers had a door with a latch that fastened from inside. She latched it the first night, stood in the dark with her hand on it, testing something. Not whether the latch held, but whether she trusted what was on the other side of it. After a few minutes, she decided she was not afraid of the man. She was afraid of being wrong about him, which was a more careful kind of fear, and one she had earned the right to have. She put both envelopes under the mattress and lay down and listened to the prairie settle into dark. The first week she learned him by watching. He was up before her, which she corrected by the third morning, rising in the cold dark to have the fire going and the coffee ready before she heard him in the barn. He came in, poured his cup, stood at the window a moment, then sat. He ate without complaint and at the end of the meal said thank you in the same level tone he used for everything. Not a performance, not a reflex, a fact. He was deliberate in the small things. He tightened the lid on the salt tin all the way before he set it back on the shelf. He hung his tools on the nails rather than leaving them on the bench. He finished things. She had known men who were careless in the small things, and she had learned what that carelessness usually predicted. So she watched his small things the way another person might watch the sky, looking for patterns. She found what she found, and she was careful with it. On the fourth day, she passed the south field on her way back from the barn and stopped. Between the grain and the fallow, there was a strip of 3 or 4 acres that had not been plowed. The ground had a different texture than the fallow. Not dead, just waiting. She asked him about it at supper. Clover, he said. Red clover and alsike, 3 seasons now. He turned his cup on the table. I don't cut it. She waited. Bees come to it, he said. I don't see the point in not having the field for them. You keep bees. No, he looked at his cup, they're not mine. She ate the rest of her supper without speaking, and he didn't either. And afterward she washed the cups and stood at the basin, thinking about a man who planted 3 acres of clover for bees that weren't his, and that he'd never harvest from. That came and went entirely on their own terms. She pushed at it from several angles, looking for the simple explanation. The simple explanation was not there. She filed it. She let it sit. Lavinia Whitford came by the 3rd week of June with a jar of choke cherry jelly, which was true, but which was also an excuse, clearly, to see what was happening at the homestead and to form an opinion about the woman who was now in it. She came in and stood in the kitchen and did her accounting without pretending she was doing anything else, her eyes moving to the curtains that hadn't been there before, and the preserves beginning to stack up on the shelf, and the kitchen garden visible through the window. You settling in all right, she said. Yes, she said, which was true, which surprised her slightly still. Lavinia Whitford had the manner of someone who collected information the way some people collect useful objects. Not out of nosiness exactly, but out of the conviction that understanding the people around you was a practical matter. She set her jelly jar on the table and looked at the garden. He say you could plant that? I didn't ask him. She poured tea. He didn't say anything about it. Lavinia Whitford looked at her a moment, then looked back at the garden and said, in the tone of someone who has just confirmed a hypothesis. She stayed for an hour. She talked about the Whitford homestead and the prospects for the harvest and the reliability of the general store in Laird, and did not ask directly about the arrangement or what it was like to be here, because she was too sharp for direct questions. She was watching. The woman who now lived in this kitchen understood that, because she was watching too, and they watched each other around the edges of everything else, and neither one said a word about it. At the door, pulling on her gloves, Lavinia Whitford paused. I'll tell you one thing about him, she said, and her voice shifted enough that it was no longer carrying conversation. It was carrying something she'd decided to say. 3 winters back, he had a cattle dog. Good one. Come spring, it went off one day and didn't come back. Half the county figured coyotes. She smoothed the seam of her glove. He looked for it 6 days, rode all the way to Laird and asked around. Never found it. Never got another one. She said nothing. Lavinia Whitford nodded once and went out. Her buggy went down the track in the midday light, and she stood in the doorway and watched it go, and thought about a man who looked 6 days for a dog he didn't find, and did not go out and replace the thing he'd lost. Just left the space where it had been and went on working. She went back to the garden. The dry stretch arrived in July and stayed. The grain was deep-rooted from the wet spring and held on, but the garden needed water, and she carried it morning and evening from the well, which was 40 yards away, and her hands went rough and raw with it. She did not mention this. The garden was her project. He noticed her hands the way she noticed most things, without looking directly at them, without making a point of it. She saw his eyes stop on her hands when she passed him the coffee pot, and she shifted her grip so the rougher skin was down, and he said nothing. 3 days later, there was a barrel set up at the corner of the house, positioned under the edge of the roof where the water came off when it rained. She had not mentioned needing one, and she had not known there was a spare on the property. She looked at it for a moment when she came out in the morning, then moved the watering can underneath it. And when the rain came that week, it filled the barrel most of the way, and that was the end of the carried water. She did not thank him for the barrel. She thought about thanking him and understood that the kind of acknowledgement the barrel deserved was not the kind that went into words. Some things you just let stand. She thought about it sometimes when her hands were busy with something else, and her mind went quiet. The barrel at the corner of the house, done without asking, without her having to explain that her hands were sore, without a word about it from either of them before or after. She turned this over the way she turned over the clover field, looking for the ordinary explanation, setting it aside when the ordinary explanation didn't come. In early August, she was dusting the shelf above the writing desk when the Bible fell open in her hands, the spine gone soft, and an envelope slid out from inside the front cover. She caught it before it hit the floor. She stood there and looked at it. Same paper, same seal. His copy of the agreement, she knew it by the handwriting on the label, which was his, not hers. She had kept her copies under the mattress where she could reach them at night if she needed to. He had kept his inside the Bible, in the place a person's hand goes every time they open it, not filed away, not put somewhere safe and forgotten, somewhere visible, somewhere he would see it regularly and be reminded. She set it back exactly as she'd found it. She finished the shelf. She went outside and stood in the August heat at the edge of the garden, and she thought about 16 jars stacked in the root cellar and about who would open them in January. And this time she let herself follow the thought all the way to where it was going, instead of cutting it off before it arrived. She went inside and started supper. The harvest came in the first week of September. He hired 2 men from Laird for the threshing, and she cooked for 4 for 3 days. Bread on the board every morning before anyone sat, coffee in the pot, the table earning its place in the room. She didn't slow down and didn't ask for help and didn't make anything of it. On the last evening, after the crew had gone back down the road and the house had settled back into its usual quiet, he stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands and said it had come in well, better than he'd hoped for from a dry summer. She said she was glad to hear it. He said the cooking had made the 3 days easier on everyone. She nodded. She put away the last of the clean plates. She did not say "you're welcome" because that phrasing belonged to a different kind of arrangement, and she couldn't name the arrangement they actually had, but she was certain it was different. September moved through its days, each one cooler than the one before, the sky lowering a little more every morning, the light going thin and gold and then gray. The garden was finished. She'd pulled the last of it the week before, everything useful in jars on the root cellar shelf. The clover field had gone to seed brown, the stalks standing dry in the wind, and the bees that were not his had gone wherever they go when the season ends. On the last Friday of September, over supper, he said the debt was settled. The season had honored the agreement in full. He said it looking at the table, the particular way he said things he didn't quite know how to handle. She said she was glad it had come out right. She cleared the plates. She did the washing up. That night, she lay with her palm flat on the mattress, feeling the envelopes through the ticking. She thought about the barrel. She thought about the Bible. She thought about a man who looked 6 days for something he'd lost and did not replace it when he couldn't find it. She thought about a kitchen that had stopped feeling borrowed somewhere in July without her noticing the day it changed. She got up and found her bag under the bed and set it on the chair where she would see it in the morning. The morning came cold and overcast, the sky the flat white of a decision already made. Frost on the water bucket, a skin of ice on the trough. She came out of her room with the bag and set it near the front door and went to build the fire and start the coffee, because those things happened regardless. He was already at the table. He had his cup. His eyes moved to the bag near the door and then back to the cup, and he did not say anything, and she did not say anything. And she made the coffee and brought his across and sat with her own. They drank in the quiet that had become, over the summer, a different kind of quiet than the one they'd started with. Not the quiet of two strangers with nothing yet to say. The quiet of two people who had said enough of the important things sideways, through the work of their hands, that not everything needed to go into words. When he finished his cup, he stood and took his coat from the hook and went out. She heard him in the yard. The wagon's creak as he checked the wheel hubs, the sound of him moving around it, the way he moved around anything he was about to put to use, making sure of it without hurrying. She sat with her empty cup. She went into her room and stood by the bed. She picked up the bag. She walked to the front door and opened it, stepped onto the porch. The board under her foot was solid, had been solid since June, and she walked down the steps and stood in the yard with the bag in her hand. He was at the far end of the wagon. He did not look up. She stood and looked at the garden. The bed was turned for winter, the soil dark and resting. Along the east edge, the clay came up harder than the rest. She'd worked it every week all summer, knew exactly where it tightened. Ash and manure turned in before the freeze would open it by spring. She had plans for the east edge. She had been thinking, without letting herself notice she was thinking, about what would do well there. She looked at the kitchen window. The curtains she'd hemmed by lamplight in late June moved once against the glass and were still. She looked at the root cellar door, latched and braced. She set her bag down on the ground. She looked at it there. She picked it back up. She went back up the porch steps and through the door and into her room and set the bag in the corner where it had lived all summer. She came back out to the kitchen and stood at the stove. The door opened behind her, his boots on the floor. He stopped somewhere in the room. She did not turn. The north wall of the root cellar wants straw banked before the freeze-up, she said. It'll bleed cold all winter if we don't get to it before the ground goes hard. The room held his quiet for a moment. There's straw in the barn, he said. I know, I've been meaning to mention it. She heard him move, the hook by the door. His coat again, then the door, and he stopped in the doorway. I'll start at the north corner, he said. Work my way around. That's where I'd start. The door closed. She stood at the stove and listened to his steps go down the porch and across the yard, steady and unhurried, the sound of a man walking toward a thing that needed doing. She took her apron down from the hook. She put it on. She went to the shelf and brought down the flour tin, and she made bread the way she had always made it, in every kitchen she had ever stood in. Pressing the dough down, folding it back, pressing again, and the stove kept its steady heat, and through the window she could see him at the far corner of the root cellar, working the straw up against the boards with a pitchfork, his back to her, methodical and unhurried. The sky above the poplars had gone from white to a deeper gray, the color of a sky that has finished deciding and is now getting on with it. The first snow would come before the week was out. She set the dough to rise near the back of the stove. She washed her hands and stood at the window. He glanced up once, not at her, at the sky, the check a person makes out of long habit, reading what was coming. Then he bent back to the straw. She dried her hands. She went to set the table for two.